They called them steel coffins. Once the hatch was sealed, the outside world ceased to exist. Every man inside knew his odds, not of victory but of survival. 3 out of 10 would live. The rest would vanish beneath the waves, swallowed by silence, crushed by pressure, or suffocated in darkness where no one could hear them scream. And yet, they volunteered. They smiled for the cameras, signed their names, and stepped into the metal tombs that would soon carry them into eternity. They believed they could outsmart death, that bravery could bend the laws of fate. But beneath the propaganda and the flags, there was only truth. They weren't hunters of the deep. They were already marked as prey. Stay with us, because this is not just another story about war. This is the story of men who fought the sea itself. At the outbreak of World War II, submarine service carried an aura of mystery and prestige. To the public, these men were heroes of a new kind of warfare, silent, unseen, deadly. In Germany, they were called the Wolves of the Atlantic, daring hunters who could choke Britain's lifeline to America. In the United States, they were the Silent Service, a brotherhood fighting beneath the waves, striking where the enemy least expected. And in Japan, they were hailed as the guardians of the empire's farthest waters. Posters showed smiling faces, clean uniforms, triumphant returns. Newspapers called them the elite of the seas. But what those posters didn't show were the mildew-covered walls, the suffocating heat, and the slow realization that each patrol could be their last. For the men who descended beneath the waves, life became a blur of diesel fumes, sweat, and fear. Each creak of the hull was a reminder of the ocean's crushing weight. Each sonar ping above was the sound of death, echoing closer. By the end of the war, reality had stripped away the illusion. The German U-boat fleet would lose 75% of its men. The Japanese submariners nearly wiped out. Even in the United States, where victory was celebrated, 22% of submariners never came home. Behind every photo of a returning crew, hundreds more were missing, lost in the deep, unmarked, unremembered. This is where our story begins. Inside the claustrophobic heart of the steel coffins, where courage met fear, and where survival itself became the only mission. Once the hatch closed, the outside world dissolved. There was no sky, no horizon, only the steel shell, the hum of engines, and the stale air that thickened with every breath. Inside the submarine, life was measured not in days or hours, but in how long the crew could endure before the air, the nerves, or the machinery gave out. The narrow corridors felt less like hallways and more like veins running through a living creature. The metal walls sweated condensation. Every surface was slick. Pipes lined the ceilings, valves hissed without warning, and the smell of diesel fuel mixed with the sourness of unwashed bodies. There was no escape from it. The stench became part of the skin. Men slept wherever there was space. 3 men shared 2 bunks in shifts, a practice grimly known as hot racking. When one man woke to begin his watch, another slid into the same still warm sheets. There was no privacy, no solitude. Even sleep offered no peace. The constant hum of engines, the groan of the hull, the faint drip of condensation created a rhythm of unease that never stopped. Some men said they could hear the sea whispering through the steel. Fresh food ran out within days. Bread turned green with mold, potatoes sprouted in the damp heat. The crew learned to eat canned rations that tasted of metal and exhaustion. Coffee was the only comfort, bitter and lukewarm. It was rationed carefully, a sacred ritual that broke the monotony of fear. Showers were a luxury no one expected. Fresh water was reserved for drinking and the engines. Men stayed unwashed for weeks, their uniforms stiff with salt and sweat. Some rubbed themselves with diesel-soaked rags just to kill the smell. Others simply stopped noticing. The human body adjusted to filth because it had no choice. The air itself was an enemy. As oxygen dwindled and carbon dioxide rose, breathing became a struggle. Men grew dizzy, irritable, and sluggish. Headaches were constant. In some U-boats, the atmosphere grew so thick that sailors described it as breathing through a wet towel. The tension hung in the air just as heavy as the heat. Tempers flared over small things, a spilled cup, a missed turn of the valve. But no one dared shout. Sound traveled too easily, and silence was their only defense. The submarine was more than a weapon. It was a prison that could kill its crew without the enemy ever firing a shot. A single spark in the battery room could ignite the hydrogen gas and turn the vessel into a fireball. Salt water leaking onto the lead-acid batteries produced chlorine gas, a green cloud that seared the lungs and blinded the eyes. When that happened, the only hope was to surface, if they were lucky enough not to be detected. Every sound mattered. The ping of sonar, the whine of machinery, even a dropped wrench could mean discovery. Men moved with the caution of ghosts. When the order for silent running came, the boat transformed. Engines cut off, fans stopped, conversations ended. Only the sound of breathing remained. The silence was unbearable. Time stretched and twisted, every second dragging into eternity. To the outside world, submarine duty looked heroic. To those inside, it was purgatory. They lived without sunlight, without color, without space to dream. The days blurred together, indistinguishable and endless. Some sailors carved small notches into the walls to mark the passage of time. Others stopped counting altogether. Letters from home were rare. Radios were silent to avoid detection. For weeks or months, a submarine existed as its own world, a metal coffin drifting through black water. Loneliness became a living thing, pressing against the mind like the weight of the sea above. In German U-boats, conditions were the harshest. Ventilation was poor, and the stench of fuel clung to everything. Officers and crew slept side by side, separated only by rank on paper. The youngest sailors, barely 19, often broke down during long patrols, whispering prayers into the dark. In American submarines, life was marginally better. There were ice machines, slightly more space, even the luxury of fresh bread for the first week. But the claustrophobia was the same. Every man knew that one mistake, one leak, one unlucky sonar sweep could end them all. Japanese submariners faced their own nightmare. Their training emphasized loyalty over survival. Missions were often one way. Many crews never expected to return. Some submarines carried experimental weapons or fuel systems so unstable that explosions were common before they even reached the enemy. Yet, the propaganda films still showed smiling faces, proud salutes, and songs about honor beneath the waves. Fear was constant, but so was routine. Every few hours, the crew rotated through their stations. Navigation, engines, torpedo maintenance, radio checks, it all continued, no matter the exhaustion. To stop was to die. Every man clung to the rhythm of duty because it was the only thing holding back madness. One sailor later wrote in his journal, "There are no nights or days down here, only hours of waiting, waiting for orders, waiting for noise, waiting for the sea to decide our fate." The submarine breathed with them, moaning and flexing under pressure as if alive. At deep depths, the hull creaked like the groan of a dying beast. Each sound was a reminder of how fragile they truly were, men suspended in a metal shell between life and oblivion. One night, during a patrol in the North Atlantic, a German U-boat suffered a power failure. The lights went out, plunging the crew into pitch blackness. The engines stalled. The air turned still. In that moment, every man could hear the slow tick of his heartbeat. Minutes felt like hours until the emergency lights flickered on again, a weak red glow that painted every face with fear. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Every man had seen what death would look like if the lights had never returned. Life inside a submarine during World War II was a paradox, endless waiting followed by seconds of chaos. The ocean could cradle them one moment and crush them the next, and yet, through every dive, every suffocating night, they endured, because endurance was the only form of victory left to them. In every submarine, there was one place more feared than any other, the forward torpedo compartment. It was the beating heart of the vessel and the most dangerous room on board. Here, the torpedo men lived and worked, surrounded by steel cylinders the size of men, each packed with hundreds of pounds of explosives. The air was thick with grease and tension. The smell of oil and sweat clung to the walls. A single spark, a single mistake, could end them all in an instant. The torpedo crew's world was one of constant motion. They loaded, maintained, and fired the submarine's only real weapon, its torpedoes. There was no margin for error. Each warhead had to be armed and fired with absolute precision. A wrong angle, a misaligned valve, a faulty detonator, and the weapon could turn on them instead of the enemy. Every launch was a gamble between triumph and annihilation. In the early years of World War II, torpedo crews across all navies faced a grim reality. Their weapons could not be trusted. In German U-boats, faulty magnetic detonators caused torpedoes to explode prematurely or not at all. Some veered off course, circling back toward the firing submarine. There are stories, whispered in training schools, of crews who watched in horror as their own torpedo curved through the black water and raced back at them, leaving no time to escape. In the United States Navy, the situation was no better. The Mark 14 torpedo, meant to be the most advanced in the world, was plagued by catastrophic flaws. It ran too deep, failed to detonate, or ricocheted off enemy hulls like stones skipping on water. Imagine the frustration, weeks of stalking an enemy convoy, risking everything to get into position, only to see the torpedo hit and bounce harmlessly away. The silence that followed was worse than an explosion. It was the silence of despair. The torpedo men bore the blame. Commanders shouted, reports were filed, investigations were launched. But for those inside the cramped, suffocating compartment, the truth was inescapable. They were risking their lives on weapons that often refused to work. Each failed shot meant more danger, because the longer they stayed near the surface, the greater the chance of being detected. For the Japanese crews, the nightmare was different, but no less deadly. Their submarines often carried experimental weapons, untested designs that sometimes exploded during handling. Safety procedures were minimal, training was short and brutal. Men learned by doing, and mistakes were fatal. The Imperial Navy prized devotion over survival. Dying in service to the Emperor was considered honorable. But in those steel coffins, honor was just another word for death. When the order came to fire, the torpedo men moved like clockwork. Every motion had to be perfect, opening the outer doors, flooding the tubes, aligning the gyros, setting the depth and speed. Sweat ran down their faces, dripping onto the metal deck as they turned valves and locked bolts into place. The sound of the launch, whoosh, was followed by a tense, breathless silence. All eyes turned to the gauges, waiting for confirmation of impact. The moments between firing and detonation were eternal. Some men held their breath until the explosion came, others whispered silent prayers. But when the torpedoes failed, when the explosion never came, the silence was broken by something worse, the sound of sonar. A sharp metallic ping echoing through the hull meant that the enemy had found them. Within minutes, depth charges would follow. The torpedo crew, trapped in the forward compartment with their own explosives, knew they would be the first to die if the hull was breached. The first explosion always came like a thunderclap. The entire boat lurched as though struck by a giant's hammer. Men were thrown against the walls, tools flew, pipes burst, then another explosion, and another. The sea itself seemed to attack from every direction. Light bulbs shattered, gauges cracked, and seawater sprayed from loosened bolts. The pressure inside the compartment rose, the air thick with dust and fear. One German survivor recalled, "It felt as if the ocean was trying to squeeze the air out of our lungs. Every explosion shook our bones. The hull groaned and we prayed it would hold. Some men cried out, others just stared into the dark, waiting for the end." For the torpedo men, the terror was doubled. They were sitting inches away from live warheads. A direct hit could trigger them, turning the entire bow into a fireball. There was no escape route, no hatches leading out, no way to reach the control room if the bulkhead sealed. Many died instantly. Others drowned, pounding on the steel walls as water rushed in faster than they could scream. Those who survived would carry that sound, the desperate pounding of trapped men, for the rest of their lives. Depth charge attacks could last for hours, sometimes days. In the North Atlantic, Allied destroyers worked in shifts, circling above and dropping explosives until they were sure the submarine was dead. Inside, the torpedo crew sat in darkness, holding onto the pipes, their ears ringing from the blasts. Each explosion felt closer than the last, the air filled with smoke, sweat, and prayers. Time lost all meaning. To endure this required more than courage. It required faith in the machine and in one another. The torpedo men formed bonds unlike any other. They shared the same danger, the same suffocating space, the same haunting silence between the explosions. They became brothers not through glory, but through fear. One American torpedo man later said, "We didn't talk about dying. We just knew it was part of the job. You learned to laugh at it because if you didn't, it would eat you alive." But laughter was rare. More often, there was only exhaustion. The human body was not meant to live in constant tension, waiting for death to come from above or within. When the submarine finally surfaced after a long attack, the men looked like ghosts, eyes hollow, faces pale, hands trembling as they reached for fresh air. The sky above felt unreal, too wide, too bright. It was a brief moment of life before they dove again into the dark. Among the Allied and Axis powers alike, the torpedo crews carried the heaviest burden. They were the first to engage the enemy and the first to die when things went wrong. Their courage was not loud or celebrated. It was quiet, mechanical, relentless. Every time they loaded a torpedo, they were loading their own fate. By the end of the war, the statistics were merciless. 75% of German U-boat crews never returned. The Japanese suffered even worse. In the United States, 22% of submariners died, numbers far higher than any other naval branch. Behind every successful mission were dozens that ended in silence. The ocean kept their secrets well. To be a torpedo man was to live on the edge of oblivion, handling weapons designed to destroy, knowing they could just as easily destroy you. They worked, sweated, and fought inside the very thing that could kill them, trusting that skill and luck would carry them home. Most of the time, it didn't. For the men who served beneath the waves, death did not always come in fire and noise. More often, it came in silence. Across every ocean, submarines vanished without a trace. They reported their last position, sent one final transmission, and then nothing. No wreckage, no survivors, just an empty sea and unanswered questions. Families waited for months, then years before a telegram arrived, missing in action, presumed lost. Those 4 words were a death sentence wrapped in uncertainty. In the Atlantic, the German U-boat fleet was decimated. Out of 40,000 men who served, 30,000 never came home. Entire crews disappeared during routine patrols, swallowed by the depths. Some were lost to enemy attacks, others to mechanical failures, fires, or simple miscalculations that sent them past crush depth, where the ocean pressure was so immense that the steel hull folded like paper. There was no time to scream, no time to pray. 1 second, they were alive. The next, they were gone. In the Pacific, the story was no different. The United States lost 52 submarines during World War II, taking 3,600 men with them to the bottom. Japan's toll was even higher, more than 60% of its submarines destroyed. The ocean floor became a graveyard of twisted steel and silent ghosts. Those who survived knew that each patrol could be their last. Every dive carried the unspoken thought, if we don't come back, no one will ever find us. There were no lifeboats, no flares, no rescue plans. Once a submarine began to sink, the end was certain. The ballast tanks flooded, the pressure grew unbearable, and within minutes, the hull imploded. Death was instantaneous and absolute. But even for those who escaped destruction, the war beneath the waves never truly ended. The survivors carried invisible scars. They spoke of the silence, not just the tactical kind, but the haunting quiet that followed every attack, the kind that settled deep into their bones. Some couldn't sleep in quiet rooms ever again. Others woke in the middle of the night gasping for air, convinced they were still trapped below the surface. One American veteran, years after the war, described it this way: "We lived in darkness so long that sunlight felt wrong. Even decades later, I'd wake up choking, thinking the air had run out. You don't escape that kind of fear. It becomes part of you." In Germany, the losses were so severe that U-boat command stopped publishing casualty figures. Families received nothing but silence. Mothers and wives lined up outside military offices, desperate for news, only to be told that the boat was delayed or on extended patrol. Eventually, the truth came through whispers. It's gone. For many, there was no grave to visit, no body to bury. Only a name carved into a memorial wall and an ocean that refused to give up its dead. In Japan, the Imperial Navy kept its submarine losses secret until the very end. Entire families never knew how or where their sons had died. Some continued to send letters addressed to their boats, believing the men would one day return. The ocean became a cruel intermediary between hope and despair. For the Allies, victory brought little comfort to those who had served below. Submarine duty was among the deadliest assignments of the war. Out of every 4 submariners, 1 never returned. But the numbers alone couldn't capture the reality. It wasn't just the dying, it was the way they died. Alone, unseen, unheard. The ocean kept its secrets well. Decades later, sonar expeditions began to locate the lost submarines, some perfectly preserved, sitting upright on the seabed. Inside, the remains of entire crews were still in place, frozen in time. Coffee cups, notebooks, uniforms, all undisturbed. It was as if the men had simply gone to sleep and never woken up. For the families who saw these discoveries, closure came with pain. Seeing the wrecks confirmed what they had long feared but never fully accepted. The ocean had become both tomb and memorial, holding on to their loved ones with cold indifference. Survivors often carried a strange guilt, the guilt of returning when so many had not. They spoke softly of their fallen comrades, rarely sharing the full truth with outsiders. Some couldn't bear to talk about it at all. For them, the silence of the sea had followed them home. An American torpedo mechanic, interviewed in 1960, said quietly, "The war ended, but the silence never did. Every time I hear the hum of an engine or the sound of water dripping, I'm back down there, waiting for the next explosion." Psychologists later called it battle fatigue or shell shock, but the truth was simpler. The human mind was never meant to live in a steel coffin for months, surrounded by fear, darkness, and death. Submarine service didn't just take lives, it reshaped the survivors into something else, something half alive, half submerged. Even in peace, they struggled to adjust. Many couldn't work in closed rooms or travel by plane. Some couldn't sleep without the hum of a fan to mimic the sound of engines. Others spent their lives avoiding the sea entirely, unable to look at the water without remembering the faces of those still down there. The legacy of the submariners is one of both tragedy and awe. They operated in the loneliest, most hostile environment on Earth. Their courage was quiet, their suffering immense. For every photograph of a smiling crew returning from patrol, there were dozens more who never came back. The propaganda had promised glory. What they found was silence. And that silence endures. Beneath the waves of the Atlantic and the Pacific lie thousands of submarines, still intact, still sealed, still waiting. Each one a monument to the men who faced the impossible and paid the ultimate price. The war ended. The world moved on. But the ocean never forgets. In war, numbers often tell stories the living cannot. They strip away the emotion, the faces, and the names, leaving behind cold arithmetic. But sometimes those numbers speak louder than any words. For the submariners of World War II, the statistics are merciless. In Germany, 75% of U-boat crews were killed. Out of 40,000 men, 30,000 never returned. In Japan, nearly 3 out of 4 submariners perished, many of them on missions that were doomed from the start. In the United States, 22% of submariners were lost, the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American Navy. No other service in the war faced odds this brutal. Pilots could bail out, soldiers could retreat, sailors on surface ships could abandon deck. But for submariners, there was no escape. Once the sea turned against them, death was absolute. Behind every statistic lies a face, a story, a family waiting for a letter that would never come. The numbers don't show the trembling hands of a sailor writing his last note home, or the mother waiting by the radio, hoping to hear her son's voice. They don't show the smell of diesel, the taste of fear, or the sound of steel buckling under pressure. But they are there, hidden in the silence between each digit. The men of the deep lived in constant calculation. They measured distance, depth, fuel, oxygen, and the passage of time. But the one equation they could never solve was the cost of survival. How many lives would it take to win? How many men could vanish before victory became meaningless? For the German U-boat command, the cost was catastrophic. At first, their submarines ruled the Atlantic, cutting off Britain's supply lines and sinking Allied convoys faster than they could be replaced. But as the Allies developed sonar, radar, and air patrols, the hunters became the hunted. Every new U-boat that slipped from the docks of Kiel or Wilhelmshaven carried fewer chances of return. By 1945, the once proud fleet had been reduced to shattered wrecks, their commanders gone, their mission lost beneath the waves. Japan, the story was one of blind faith. Their submarines, though technically advanced, were deployed in missions that defied logic: kamikaze runs, cargo transports, or desperate last strikes. Each voyage was a suicide written in orders. When the war ended, only a handful of Japanese submarines survived, and their crews were ghosts walking through a country too broken to remember them. Even in the United States, where submarines played a vital role in cutting Japan's maritime lifelines, the price was high. 52 boats never returned. 3,600 American sailors remain entombed in the Pacific to this day. Their names are carved into marble walls, their coordinates marked only by ocean currents and memory. It is easy, decades later, to read these figures in a textbook and move on. But to truly understand them, you must imagine what they represent: the sound of a final sonar ping, the pressure of crushing depth, the last breath of air before the sea fills your lungs. The ocean became both battlefield and burial ground. Its silence is eternal. For historians, the statistics reveal the scale of sacrifice. For those who lived it, they reveal something deeper: the unbearable endurance of the human spirit. These men did not fight for medals or recognition. They fought because it was their duty, because someone had to, because once they descended beneath the waves, the only way home was through courage and luck. The irony of submarine warfare is that it was both the most invisible and the most personal. Battles happened in darkness, unseen by the world. Victories were uncelebrated, defeats were unrecorded. Yet every crew lived each second at the edge of human endurance. They were not faceless soldiers lost to history. They were fathers, sons, brothers, and lovers who carried the weight of silence on their shoulders. Numbers can measure loss, but they cannot measure the quiet heroism of those who endured. They cannot measure the fear that hardened into resolve, the despair that turned into duty. As time passes, the survivors grow fewer, their voices fading like echoes under the sea. But their story remains carved in steel and salt water. It is written in the rusting hulls lying on the ocean floor, each one a monument to courage and the cruel simplicity of war's arithmetic. To look at those numbers is to confront the truth that war is not measured in victories or defeats, but in lives consumed and memories erased. The submariners of World War II remind us that courage often exists in silence, and that some battles are fought not to win, but simply to endure. The war beneath the waves was unlike any other. There were no front lines, no banners, no songs of triumph, only darkness, pressure, and the steady hum of machinery carrying men into the unknown. In World War II, submarine crews waged a war that the world could barely imagine. They fought not only the enemy, but the ocean itself. Theirs was a war of endurance, a battle measured in heartbeats, not victories. And when the fighting ended, their story sank with them, buried in silence. Yet the silence has a voice. It speaks through the wrecks lying on the seabed, through the memorial walls engraved with names, through the memories of the few who lived to tell what it was like inside those steel coffins. They remind us that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers in the quiet between explosions, in the steady hands of men who kept working even as the sea closed in around them. The legacy of these men is not in the battles they won or the ships they sank. It is in the endurance of the human spirit. In the face of terror, they found routine. In the presence of death, they found purpose. And in the vast loneliness of the deep, they found each other. In the chronicles of World War II, their names are not written in medals or parades, but in silence. It is a silence that demands respect. A silence that reminds us that every victory comes with a cost. and that the true measure of heroism is not how loudly one fights, but how quietly one endures. Today, thousands of submarines still lie at the bottom of the oceans. Some are German, some American, some Japanese. But down there, beneath the waves, the flags no longer matter. The sea has made them equal. Each hull, each rivet, each rusted nameplate tells the same story of bravery, fear, and sacrifice. And as we remember World War II today, may we remember the price of peace. May we honor those who vanished beneath the surface, whose courage was unseen but unbroken. Because their story is not only about war, it is about what it means to be human. If you believe their voices deserve to be heard, type one word in the comments below: peace. For in that single word lies everything they fought for: freedom, memory, and the fragile hope that the world above the waves will never forget those who died beneath them.